So you've decided that you don't want to live in DC, but now the question is, do you live in Virginia or do you live in Maryland? Let's look at some things you should consider before making your final decision. One of the biggest factors to consider before choosing where you live is how much it's actually going to cost you to live there. How much is it going to cost to get a house? How much will it cost you to get your food? These are things that directly impact your day-to-day life and your day-to-day bank account. I typically use bestplaces.net as a reference point for an area's cost of living, since their score factors in costs for housing, food, transportation, and other everyday costs. Their scores start at 0 and then go up from there, with a score of 100 equating to the national average. According to bestplaces.net data, the areas of Maryland that are located right around DC typically don't exceed a cost of living score of 140, meaning that they're up to 40% more expensive than the national average. That's in comparison to DC's score of 152, 52% more expensive than the national average. This makes a good case for Maryland suburbs being more expensive than a lot of the US and less expensive than DC. But how about in comparison to Virginia? As for Northern Virginia, depending on where you choose to live, the cost of living scores can be pretty high. For example, Arlington has a cost of living score of 164, and Falls Church has a cost of living score of 177. That's pretty significantly higher than both DC and the rest of the country, and you don't really see big improvements until you go well out of the Virginia Beltway. So factoring all of this in, if cost of living is your biggest concern, you're probably going to want to look in Maryland first rather than Virginia. Taxes are another factor that are going to impact your day-to-day life in a very big or maybe not so big way. As usual, it really depends on which area you're living in, because each county, and sometimes even city, has different tax rates for different things. The good news, to make your decision a tiny bit easier, is that both Maryland and Virginia sales tax rates are 6%. There are a couple of categories that are taxed at a somewhat lower rate, but to help make this an easier comparison, I'm only considering the 6% rate. Now on to the somewhat more complicated comparisons. Income taxes for both Virginia and Maryland are capped at a rate of 5.75%. That said, they are structured a little differently, which could make a big impact on how much you actually take home. Let's look at it a little bit closer. In Virginia, there are 4 tax brackets that are considered for income taxes. As you can see in this chart, the first tax bracket goes from $0 to $3,000. The next tax bracket goes from $3,001 up to $5,000. The third bracket is from $5,001 up to $17,000. And then the final bracket covers any income over $17,001. With the way that the tax brackets are broken up in Virginia, unless you're able to bring your taxable income to $17,000 or less, you are automatically paying the highest tax rate in the state. Now, let's look at Maryland in comparison. Maryland also has a max income tax rate of 5.75%. But the tax rates are spread between a few different brackets, so instead of just automatically paying the highest rate in the state, there's actually a little bit more flexibility. As you can see in this chart, you don't actually hit the 5.75% rate until you get over $250,000 of income. If we do a direct comparison to the Virginia top tax bracket that starts at $17,001, if you were making that same $17,001 in Maryland, you would be paying a 4.75% tax rate. Before we get too excited and say that Maryland is the winner, we also have to factor in that each county in Maryland has its own additional local income taxes, and even some of the cities have their own income taxes. As an example, Montgomery County levies a 3.2% income tax on Montgomery County residents. That's on top of the Maryland state income tax rate, which means that realistically, if you happen to be in the top Maryland tax bracket of 5.75%, you would actually be paying a total tax rate of 8.95%. That's a pretty big jump. Prince George's County, which is the other primary Maryland county right next to DC, also has a 3.2% county tax rate. If you're curious about other counties and their tax rates, I've provided a link in the description to a Maryland tax page that has that information. Now that we've dug into the tax rates a little bit more between Maryland and Virginia, I think I have to give the win to Virginia. Even though you're pretty much in the top tax bracket right from the get-go, those county taxes are pretty rough. Now, just one more tax and then I promise we'll move on to the next category. This next tax is specific to Virginia, and it is a very popular topic for people to complain about. This is the personal property tax, and it's also better known as the car tax. The personal property tax applies in all cities, counties, and towns in Virginia. So unless you move somewhere else, you're not likely to escape it. The personal property tax is specifically focused on motor vehicles that are garaged in the city, county, or town. And when I say motor vehicles, I mean all of them. It could be a car, an RV, a bus, a boat, or even a plane. All of these are subject to the personal property tax. There are some exemptions for students, diplomats, and military members, but for the most part, every vehicle is subject to this tax. The tax rate varies based on what city, county, or town you're in. But in Northern Virginia, the tax rates generally range from about $4.50 to $5.50 per $100 of the vehicle's assessed value. In Arlington, there is some tax relief for personal vehicles up to the first $20,000 of value, so the price tag isn't quite as bad as you might think. Even with that, it's not cheap, and when you get the bill during the year, it can be kind of a shock. Last year, my personal property tax bill was almost $500, and that was for a 5-year-old car that was only about $20,000 when I bought it. If you have a newer car that's worth more, you can be pretty sure that your tax bill is going to be at least a little bit higher. If you'd like to know a little more about the personal property tax, check out this other video where I get really into detail on the personal property tax for Arlington. The clear winner here is Maryland, for the very simple fact that they just don't have the personal property taxes. Getting to where you're going is an essential part of daily life. So what does that look like in Virginia and Maryland? To start us off, let's just set the foundation that traffic in the DC metro area can be pretty terrible no matter where you are. It seems like there's always something happening on the roads, which means that getting from A to B takes that much longer. So back to the question, which is better, Virginia or Maryland? Well, in this case, it's really hard to say. Virginia and Maryland both have pretty bad traffic, with rush hours that go from about 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. and then again from 1:30 or 2 p.m. until about 7 p.m. Pro tip, if you're traveling during these times, plan on doubling the time that it would take you if you traveled with no traffic. It also really depends on where you're commuting from and commuting to, since you'll have less traffic to fight with if you're fortunate enough to be going opposite traffic. I've also personally found that Maryland kind of has worse roads, which can add to the stress of getting to where you're going. Normally, I would just think that that's me being picky, but according to a recent Wallet Hub survey looking at the best and worst states to drive in, Maryland ranked last out of all 50 states for traffic and infrastructure. Maryland also is ranked 40 out of 50 on the study overall. I will say Virginia didn't do much better, coming in at an overall 21 out of 50 and ranking 43rd on traffic and infrastructure. Do keep in mind that these rankings are for the entire state. If we consider just the DC metro region, there will probably be some variation for these numbers, but it may also be a big contributing factor to why these two states ranked so poorly. If you're looking at commuting by public transit, you're in luck, because the Maryland and Virginia areas around DC have a pretty healthy public transit system. Both Maryland and Virginia have about the same number of metro stops within the 495 Beltway, so it's fairly easy to get where you're going. One thing to note is that most of the metro stations in Virginia inside the Beltway are concentrated in Arlington and Alexandria, whereas the metro stops in the Maryland portion of the Beltway are spread out between several different locations, to include Bethesda, Silver Spring, Hyattsville, and others. In addition to all the metro stops, there's also a pretty healthy bus system to get you to those places in between the metro stops. It's not going to be as quick or as easy as driving a car, but it will get you where you're going. Considering all of this, Virginia might be slightly ahead in the commuting category, but in reality, there's really no clear winner between Virginia and Maryland, so I think I'm going to call it a tie. These last two categories I'm kind of lumping together because they're pretty much the same in both Maryland and Virginia. So while there's no clear winner, they are good to know about regardless of which option you choose. First up are the amenities. Both Northern Virginia and Maryland have really great amenities. There are a ton of food places, plenty of entertainment options, and also a lot of historical attractions. So just know that you'll have plenty of things to do in whichever location you choose. On top of that, if you're not feeling the local stuff, you're not too far from everything that the rest of the region has to offer. As for the weather, it's also pretty similar between Maryland and Virginia. We have all 4 seasons here, and generally get a good amount of rain regardless of the season. There's also a good amount of humidity, making the hot season hotter and the cold season colder. If the winner of this competition has caught your interest though, be sure and watch the next video where I talk about some of the suburbs that might be great places for you to consider living.